Welcome to Sunday Sermons, brought to you by the Chapel Podcast Network. Let's grab our Bibles and open up to the book of John, chapter 6, verses 24 through 51. And I'll read verses 33 through 35 for us now, as we prepare to hear from Rich Sylvester as he helps us kick off our new sermon series titled, Knowing the Road In. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. They said to him, Sir, give us this bread always. Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst.
My family has a game that we invented that we love to play when we're out and about around town. We simply call it the colonial game. And the game goes like this. If you see somebody dressed in a colonial outfit anywhere other than Duke of Gloucester Street or Colonial Williamsburg, then you point to them and yell, Colonial, and you get a point and you win. So we do this in public places, which I must then apologize to any of you who may work in Colonial Williamsburg, who may wear your outfit into spaces like Food Lion. If at any time over the last 23 years, somebody in my family has come to you, pointed and yelled, Colonial, I win, that's my fault. But we loved playing that game. We still play that game. I remember when we go to supermarkets as a family, our kids would scatter through the aisles and you'd hear one of them yell, Colonial, aisle 3, I win. Even this past Christmas, I took Hudson, my oldest, who's 20, to Taco Bell for a late night Taco Bell run. How do you love a college kid? Take him to Taco Bell. And we were walking into the restaurant, if that's what you call Taco Bell, and Hudson popped out again real quick and said, Dad, Colonial, he's eating a Crunchwrap Supreme. I win. Because the Colonials, they stand out a little bit, you know, they stick out. They don't necessarily belong in our clothing style around town, but they remind us of a different time and a different place. And I will say, it's one of the great things I love about living in Williamsburg is that there's Colonials among us. So it's great. But I thought about that game a lot this week as I read through the Gospel of John, preparing for this sermon. I like to read through the whole book of what I'm going to preach on and get a survey of what's going on. And as I read through it, I thought of the colonial game, not because the gospel writer John is talking about colonials, but because he's playing a game similar to me, right? He's leaving us hints and pictures and words within his gospel that point us to another time and place. You see, he keeps pointing us back to the Exodus. And I found that I was reading through John, I was pointing to the text going, Exodus, I win, because they're everywhere. John has Exodus on the mind as he's writing his gospel. You don't have to read into the gospel far. Chapter 1, verse 14. John writes, in the beginning was the Word, right? And he says, the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. Exodus, I win. I almost got you, Greg. That was good. That was good. You got to say, I win after you say it, Greg. Tabernacled. The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. John is picking a word that makes his readers and his listeners and his hearers go back to that time and place. He wants them to think through the tabernacle, that big tent that God had his people set up where God's presence would dwell among them and where they could worship him. John has Exodus on his mind. You read a few verses farther. John chapter 1, verse 29. Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Exodus. Good job, Greg. Good job. You did win that one. Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. John is using that phrase, Lamb of God, to bring us back to the Passover meal. He wants us to remember that meal that God instituted in Exodus. That meal where that blood of the lamb would cleanse his people, would keep them safe, would give them life. And so we have Exodus on John's mind in everything he does. If we fast forward a little bit to chapter 8, we find Jesus is in an argument with the Pharisees. And he says to them, Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. Exodus. Man, you guys are so slow at this game. You'd be awful at the colonial game. Exodus is everywhere. Before Abraham was, I am. Now, you could look at it and think there's a grammatical error. Before Abraham was, I was, sounds like a better sentence, but the Pharisees didn't start picking up rocks to stone Jesus because of some grammatical error. No, what Jesus was doing was that he was using that phrase, I am, and bringing his listeners back to Exodus. In Exodus chapter 3, God is in the burning bush, and he presents himself to Moses, and he says, Moses, I need you to go back to Egypt. I need you to help rescue my people from slavery. And Moses says, well, if I go back, God, who shall I tell them that sent me? Well, what's your name, God? And God says, I am who I am. Tell them, say to the people of Israel, I am has sent you. John wants us to see that Jesus is the God of the Exodus, that he is God himself, that he has come to rescue us. John has the Exodus on his mind. And John wants us to see that Jesus is the road in. That Jesus is the road in. Now, if you remember back in the fall, we started this preaching series called The Exodus Way. That Exodus is not only a historical event, but a pattern for how God rescues his people, right? The Exodus is not merely an historical event, but a pattern for how God rescues his people. And there's three parts to the Exodus way. There's the road out, the road between, and the road in. And we looked at all three components of this road. We looked at the road out, where God used his miraculous power to bring the plagues on Egypt and to soften Pharaoh's heart. And when the people were leaving Egypt, and the Egyptian army was coming from one direction and the Red Sea surrounded them on the other, when they were enveloped by death, God opened up the sea and created a road out of death, a road out of chaos, a road out of slavery. But then the people found themselves on the road between, in the wilderness, where they encountered limited resources and new enemies, and where they battled the sin and the idolatry in their own hearts. And on that road between, they learned to trust God who had rescued them. And then there's the road in, the final part of that road, of that Exodus way, where the people would walk into God's presence, into God's power, into God's promises. But if you remember, the people never really fully realized that road in. They never truly walked that road in. We heard how in Exodus chapter 40, how God's presence filled the tabernacle so intensely that Moses could not go in. Moses could not experience the full presence of God. And then in Judges, we saw in Judges chapter 3 that as God's people entered the land, they didn't do what God said. They didn't eliminate all the people that lived there, and instead they married sons and daughters, and they started worshiping the gods of the inhabitants of that land. And because of that, they never fully achieved the fullness of God's promise. And the prophets reminded us that God's people denied God's power by turning continually to disobedience and idolatry time and time again. God's people did not fully walk the road in. They did not walk the road into God's presence, into God's promises, into God's power. And so John writes his gospel with Exodus on his mind, and he says to us, Jesus is the road in. Jesus is the road in to God's presence, to God's promises, to God's power. Jesus is the road in. So how then do we know this road? How do we know Jesus? Well, John will help us out with that too. That great I am statement, that brings us back to the name of God and the God of the Exodus. Jesus will use that several times, and John will highlight 7 times in his gospel where Jesus reveals himself, where Jesus reveals the road in to each of us through those I am statements. Jesus will say, I am the light of the world. Jesus will say, I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. And today, as we have already read, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. I am the bread of life. And so, with Exodus on our minds, let's dive into today's passage and get to know Jesus. Let's get to know this road in. Now, we started reading a bit into the passage, but the chapter 6 begins as John tells us that Jesus and his disciples have crossed to the far side of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus and his disciples were looking to escape the crowds. And Jesus took his disciples up on top of a mountain. And John says that there on top of the mountain, Jesus was teaching his disciples. He was discipling them. He was talking about truth. John says it was Passover, and a large crowd started coming towards them. John says 5,000, but we know how counting was done in the ancient world. It was probably more accurately like 5,000 married men with their wives and their children. So maybe as many as 20,000 people start walking towards that mountain where Jesus and his disciples are. And as that crowd comes, Jesus turns to his disciples and he says, hey, it's getting late. Where do you think we should go to buy all these people some bread? Now, if you guys were any good at the colonial game, you'd be going, Exodus, 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 I win. Because there is Exodus all over this story, right? John sets this story up with clear imagery of the Exodus. They cross a sea to escape the crowds. Sounds like the Red Sea. They climb a mountain to sit with Jesus. Sounds like Sinai. The time, John says, is Passover. And what does Jesus want to do? He wants to feed a crowd of hungry people some bread. Sounds like manna. John has Exodus on his mind. Well, Jesus asked them this question, and the disciples respond. You want us to feed all of them? There is no way, Jesus. There is no way we can feed that many people. One disciple says, it would take 8 months' wages just to give everybody one bite of food. We can't feed all these people, Jesus. Another disciple brings over a young boy who's carrying his bag lunch from home. This kid has 5 little loaves of bread, these little barley cakes that were just a couple bites big. And he's got 2 fish. Don't think grouper, think minnows. He's got 5 loaves and 2 fish, and maybe that'll help, Jesus? And Jesus looks at his disciples and he says, hey, why don't you have everybody sit down? And Jesus took the loaves and he gave thanks and he broke them apart and he started distributing them to the people. And he did the same with the fish. And the gospel writer tells us that everyone ate till they were full. Everyone there, the 20,000 in the crowd, were completely satisfied. And afterwards, the disciples collected 12 full baskets of leftovers. What a miracle. It's the only miracle we read about in all 4 of the gospel accounts. This incredible reality that with 5 little loaves and 2 little minnows, Jesus can feed everybody. John tells us that Jesus did a lot of incredible things. At the end of his gospel, maybe a hyperbolic statement, but John says, all the books in the world could not contain all the miracles that Jesus did. But John says that he chose these miracles to show us, these miracles to record in his gospel, because they were chosen to be signs. Signs that don't point to the power of Jesus, but signs that point to the identity of Jesus. They're not signs that show us how strong he is, but signs that show us who he is. In other words, the feeding of the 5,000 is not simply a display of what Jesus can do, but a display of who he is. Jesus says basically the same thing, because the next day, all those in the crowds that ate all that yummy food, they show up again. They show up looking for Jesus. And in verse 26, Jesus says, you are seeking me, not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of loaves. In other words, Jesus is saying, you're coming to me to see what I can do for you today, but you should be coming to see me for who I am. He says, you're trying to get use of my power to solve one of your problems, but I want you to come to me because of who I am and to know me. That stood out to me this week. It made me ask myself a question. How do I approach Jesus? Do I merely approach Jesus when I need some of his power in my life? I remember as a kid, we used to pass the mic in church looking for testimonies of what Jesus did. And there was this one woman that would always raise her hand and she'd say things like, well, I prayed for a parking space this week and I got it. And I always thought, is that really why we want to go to Jesus? And I think Jesus is saying, you're coming to me because you want something from me, but I want you to come to me for who I am. If I'm honest with myself, I'm not much different than the lady in my church growing up. Sometimes I go to Jesus because I want something, because I want to see what he can do for me, not merely because I want to know him. And in the midst of that tension, Jesus looks at the crowd and he says, I am the bread of life. He says it twice, verse 35 and verse 48. I am the bread of life. See, Jesus is telling us who he is. He's teaching us about that road in by teaching us about himself, because Jesus is the road in. And we first learn that the road in is the road to ultimate satisfaction. The road in is the road to ultimate satisfaction. Now, bread is certainly a more profound meaning in the minds of the hearers here than it is for us. At 49, when I try to get back in shape, I shouldn't say stay in shape. I've lost shape a while ago. But bread is certainly something you're supposed to cut out of your diets. Bread is all carbs and no nutrition. That's what they tell me. But I like eating bread. But the people there, bread was their substance. It was the foundation of their diet. Their food, it was the food that sustained them. Bread kept them going. In the Lord's Prayer, when the disciples say, "Teach us to pray," Jesus says, say this, "Give us this day our daily bread." In other words, Jesus says, pray, Jesus, give us everything we need today to live. And I believe that Jesus' audience, well, they would have Exodus on the brain too. When they heard this word bread, clearly they would be thinking of the manna in the wilderness. Clearly they would be thinking of that Exodus journey. Remember, right after the people crossed through the Red Sea, just a few days from leaving Egypt, they started to grumble. They started to get hungry, and they said, Jesus, or Moses, did you bring us all the way out here just so that we can starve in the wilderness? Give us some food. And God said, I'll be your food. I will send bread from heaven. And 6 days a week, he scattered manna on the ground. They would collect enough for the day, and they'd turn it into these cakes, and they'd bake it, and it had this incredible taste of honey. It was satisfying and good, and it gave them everything they needed to get through that day. When Jesus says, I am the bread of life, he's saying, I am all that you need. I am your ultimate satisfaction if you would just trust me. How would that impact our lives if we really believed that? I'm going to get honest for a moment. I'm good at worrying. I can have a level of anxiety. And for some of you, you don't like to hear that us pastors are not perfect. I am not perfect. I worry. I worry too much. And if I'm honest about the things that I worry about, they're often things that maybe give me meaning or identity or a sense of security or value in my life, right? I worry that I won't get those things, or maybe I'll lose those things. Does that resonate with you at all? What things do you worry about? Do you worry about your reputation? Do you worry about your 401k or what your salary is? Do you worry about your class rank or your grades or an offer that you're waiting to get? What do you worry about? Because if the truth of Jesus' statement that he is the bread of life, that he is our ultimate satisfaction, if that seeps into our souls, then those things won't mean as much. We won't get angry when we lose them, and we won't worry that we're not going to get them, because Jesus is enough. He's all that we need. He's our ultimate satisfaction, and everything else we worry about is meaningless compared to what we have in Jesus. The road in is the road to ultimate satisfaction, but it's also the road into restored relationship. When Jesus said, I am the bread of life, bread would certainly make some people think of manna in the wilderness, but others would think of another reality of the Exodus. Now, if I had a quiz and said, name some of the furniture that you find in the tabernacle, anybody want to shout out something that was in the tabernacle? Come on, it's the 11 o'clock service. We can get a little interactive. What is it? Lampstand, Hunter. Went to seminary, Dallas Theological. Good job. What else was in the tabernacle? Showbread. Nice. I want to talk about that one. The altar of showbread. A table with 12 loaves of bread on it. God's command to have it there. And the priests at times would eat that bread, and then they'd replace it with fresh baked bread. But it was bread for a meal between God and the priests, between God and his people. It was a space where God and his people would break bread together. We understand that idea of breaking bread and what that can do for relationships. You meet up with an old college friend you haven't seen in years. What do? You go get a meal together. It's date night and you want to take your spouse out. What do? You go get a meal together. You find somebody that you meet new in the community, and what do? You invite them over to your house for a meal, because breaking bread together was the forming and sustaining of a relationship. In Exodus, remember that the people of Israel gathered around Mount Sinai. And when they did, God's presence was on the top of the mountain, and he said, "Don't touch the mountain. I am holy, you are sinful. I am infinite, you are finite. I am perfect, you are flawed." And he said, "Don't touch the mountain, you will die." But in Exodus chapter 24, God says to Moses, "Go and take the blood from the sacrifice and sprinkle it on the people. Sprinkle it on the elders. And when you've done that, I want you to grab Aaron and the 70 elders, and I want you to come up Mount Sinai to see me." And when the elders went up, they didn't die, and they saw this overwhelmingly beautiful scene with glory and splendor. And the elders sat down with God, and what did they do? They broke bread together. They ate together. They drank together. You see, when Jesus says, "I am the bread of life," he says, "I am your road into restored relationship. I am the bridge between the infinite and the finite, between the holy and the sinful. I am the road in," Jesus says, "the road into ultimate satisfaction, the road into restored relationships." And Jesus says, "I am the road into true life." In Greek, there are two words for life, right? There's the simple word, bios, which is where we get our word biology. And you can flip the slide, Cliff. And that bios is just meaning a word of existence. It has a pulse, or it is alive. I guess plants don't have a pulse and they're alive. Bios, it's alive. But zoe is another word for life, and this is something that means a quality of life, a fullness of life, an excitement of life, a power in life. You know, years ago, we were on vacation with my 3 boys, and I remember one of them was floating on a float in a pool. I think we were down in Florida somewhere. And he had sunglasses on, and he was holding a Shirley Temple, which is our family's favorite vacation drink. And he's floating there in the water, sipping his Shirley Temple, and he just says, "Dad, this is living." He was existing before that. He was bios, but this was zoe. This was the fullness of life. This was everything he had hoped and dreamed for. Jesus said, "I am the bread of zoe. I bring life that is full of joy and generosity and abundance and peace and wholeness." And Jesus says, "And you can have it now." He wants you to have it now. Jesus is the road in. He's the road into satisfaction. He's the road into a restored relationship with our Creator. He's a road into life, full, abundant, fruitful, wonderful life. And this morning we gather at the table, a table set for us, set by the bread of life, with the bread of life. So this morning, let us feast together and find our ultimate satisfaction in Jesus. Find our restored relationship in Jesus, and find true Zoe life in Jesus.
Thanks for joining us today. Here at the chapel, we are all about making disciples of Jesus Christ. And we hope you'll join us as we walk the Exodus way and learn to trust God on the way out of Egypt, the way between in the wilderness, and the way into His presence.